Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. The July solo show, recorded on the very last day of July. And I was a bit concerned about that because I did promise one a month, and the June one came in at the beginning of July, and I was kind of concerned that I'd have a concertina crash build-up of solo shows from the end of the year if I didn't get this out. And also, as regular listeners will know, I was unwell last week or the week before when I was planning to do a solo show in Melbourne about place and so on. But got sick, lost my voice, and it made me realize that, and this is all, as it's happening, I'm like, of course. I'm in Melbourne for a bunch of reasons, but one of them was a venue scout for a super secret project that I will tell you about in the coming weeks, but also to do some research for other projects and things that I've got ongoing. And typically when I get to Melbourne, the first thing I do is go to my favourite, I guess, Melbourne bookstore, which is Readings, because they have a lot of academic stuff as well. Like, it's a good, well-selected range. And it was closed for refurbishment, and so they had a pop-up store across the road, which I went to, and it was fine, and I got some of the stuff. But the range was reduced, obviously, because it's a pop-up store. And this entire experience is very Mars Retrograde. As you can tell from the title of everything retrograde, I kind of wanted to pivot, given that the show was delayed, to talking about my experience of that and the experience of talking to about a dozen of you going through this same sort of process. Because I don't think we're aware of quite how many plates we have spinning until someone switches the BDE power off at the wall, which is Mars Retrograde, right? So it got me thinking about how I want to tackle that. And I guess I still haven't landed on an opinion on whether astrology has more of an impact in the lives of people who follow or, I guess, perform astrology than those who don't. And I think maybe it does, at least insofar as we're all kind of buffeted around, in this model, we're all buffeted around by the same cosmic forces, right? And there is a risk, maybe I'm looking for the word calcify here, people who don't have a sufficiently complex cycle model in which to process the good and the bad that happens to them may calcify around some coping mechanisms that would potentially only have limited utility. Some of them may be good. There are other ways to stay sane in an unpredictable world, right? But what something like astrology has going for it is, put it this way, if your model is informed by, or if your frame is informed by, at least in part, astrology or some kind of cycle model or so on, I think you get higher lows and higher highs. So you're kind of aware of when bad things happen, you have a way of processing it that doesn't require you, rending your clothing and yelling at the stars kind of thing, right? But there's also, particularly when it comes to astrology, how to describe this? It makes you small in a good way. So there's an ego moderation effect where your crises are put in the context of the flow of the cosmos, right? Of which you are currently a resident. And I guess the flip side of that, so there's the beneficial ego moderation effect of not becoming Twitter in real life and saying this is the worst thing that's ever happened to anyone ever, is there's a sense of we're all in it together. Like if these, in the model, because it is a cosmic cycle interactional force or whatever you want, it's impacting the entire cosmos. So you are healthily small, but you are also not alone in the experience of it. And I think those two are quite useful, even if you only approach astrology metaphorically, they're quite useful. And the third one, which Austin and I speak about almost every time he's on the show, is that baked-in wisdom that this too shall pass. So you have that bad things will happen, they will happen again, the bad things will end, some good things will continue, and you have that really potentially quite healthy way of dealing with challenges and the unpredictable. But for this episode, I mean, it's called Everything Retrograde because, goodness, what a sky we have with the eclipse and everything else. But I specifically want to talk about Mars Retrograde because of the dozen or so people I've had a chat to about their experience of what's going on, a few of you have, I was going to say been tempted, but I guess the word is felt the compulsion to participate in toxic internet arguments, which are always a bad idea, not just during Mars retrograde, but always. However, in general, it does seem to be a feeling of bringing it back to the Melbourne stuff. Putting in 120% of the effort to get 60% of the results. So it's not so much a failure or an experience of failure, in the same way you might get a complete comms failure during Merc-Ret, which we're also in the middle of, right? But it's more that concertina build-up of delays and making it harder to achieve things that didn't used to be that difficult. So more effort for less results. And Melbourne was a good example of that for me. As I said, there was, and because I was unwell, I didn't get to see about half the venues I was looking at, couldn't find the books, I got some of the books and I got to see some of the venues, and I'm going back to look at other ones. So it's that sort of more effort for a 60% result. Now, when it comes to the farm, boy howdy, are we feeling Mars Ret on the farm? So probably most of you know that we're in the process of redoing the guest house so it can be used as accommodation. The catch with that, it's a couple of months delayed. That's not necessarily Mars Ret. That's just if you've ever done it, and I haven't before, although I've grown up in a house that has. Nothing goes according to plan with renovations or whatever. So we were kind of emotionally and psychologically ready for those sort of delays. But now that we have a very good builder, the catch is the building work on the guest house has to fit around his other projects because he was our emergency ring-in because the last one was essentially a fraud. And his main building project at the moment is his own damn house that he is building for his family, which very obviously takes priority. But as a result of this, so it's coming along, but it's not yet done. All the stuff, so, the beds and the kitchen stuff and the oven and all that kind of thing, which belong in the guest house, is currently in the workshop/shed. As a result of that, there is no room in the workshop to do the things that we should have had done by now, like building the sort of 5-bay compost row behind the tractor shed. And as a result of that, we haven't started on the compost we need for the kitchen garden. And this is the kind of concertina challenges. And the biggest one, because obviously we're, frankly, coming towards the end of winter. So, obviously we're in the Southern Hemisphere. So August is when, in theory, if you have a greenhouse, you will start your starts for kitchen garden, whatever else you got going on, right? I don't have a greenhouse. I don't have a greenhouse for a very good but very Mars Ret reason. So when I was out in the desert with the Solari tour in May, one of the many remarkable people in Catherine's orbit is this engineering genius, and as fate would have it, she and a friend are starting a greenhouse startup. So obviously we chatted greenhouses. She's American. Agreed that she's going to come out and do some of the sort of test best class or best practice things that she's got in her head for how greenhouses should or could be. And that's too good an opportunity to pass up, right? However, she's not here. And even if she was here, the project wouldn't be complete in time for me to get the starts in, which I need to do in the next couple of weeks, right? But that's kind of fine, because that is a delay and extra effort, which in this case involved me driving up and down the valley to various big box retailers looking for the cheapest domestic, sort of like backyard little greenhouse things, which were mercifully on sale. So I got about 4 or 5 of them, which is enough for the couple of hundred starts that we need for the kitchen garden, for a first round of kitchen garden, right? So that's the kind of lots of effort the entire way up to spitballing some really amazing. Like, if I get this done correctly, this will be definitely the best greenhouse in Tasmania. Remember in the last solo show, we were talking about cool cupboards and the idea that that's free energy rather than low energy, right? From that perspective, so there are some ways that we need to think with greenhouses that could certainly be optimized. And I'm very keen to go down that journey. It just means for the first growing season, I won't have one. But so I've done all this diligence on greenhouses. Before I met this woman, I'd gone the entire way to like looking at where to source the right greenhouse material from China and chatting to local builders and so on. So I've gone 120% effort for, at best, 60% result for this spring, which is 4 or 5 domestic greenhouses that we're going to lash to the fence so that the southerlies don't have them sail away, which can happen. My neighbor told me, he begged in no uncertain terms, he said, please don't do a polytunnel. I've seen 2 of them on your exact property, like, fly over the river. So he's lived in Geefston his whole life, so I'm going to listen to that, right? Anyway, that's the kind of feel, or my experience of Mars Retrograde has been and is a lot of effort. You still get, it's not so much failure, but it's a lot of effort and a kind of victory, right? And so the Melbourne show that I had planned was going to be about place and urban versus non-urban and so on, because obviously I would have been in an urban context. However, because it didn't work, and because I attribute that at least in part to Mars Ret, we're talking about this. So I sort of cast my mind around for like, well, let's find a historical account that matches my sensation of Mars Retrograde. And because it's me, it's going to be a tale of the sea. And in a funny way, it is almost place-bound, because I first heard the story from my paternal grandfather in Perth as a kid. And it's a story set off northwestern Australia, and it kind of involves the Sunderland Sahul colonial experience, of which I have like a family connection, again, thanks to that same grandfather. Curiously enough, the story does not take place during Mars Retrograde, but hold that thought, because there is a interesting twist towards the end of it. But it is to my mind, coolest shipwreck story in European history. And probably if you're Australian listening to it, you'll have some awareness of it. And if you are Dutch and listening to it, you may have some awareness of it. And if you are some kind of salty sea dog who listens to the show, you also may not. But I think for a lot of you, it might be new. And it is the story of the Batavia and the sinking of the Batavia, which happened in 1629 in June. But this was a Dutch East India Company ship, and it was named for their principal town, Batavia, in Java, where they had the colony, right? And it's an enormous, it's almost a Titanic story, but not. So it had 10 sails, it had 21 kilometers of rigging, and the kind of Mars Ret experience is that of the supercargo, which was the VOC term for essentially, it's kind of like captain, but it's more most senior corporate representative, guy by the name of Pelsad. And the actual captain, Adrian Jacobs. And this boat obviously was going to be part of the spice trade. But it was also bringing lots of people and wealth out, because they were sort of permanentizing or expanding the settlement of Batavia. So it had chests of silver. It had 2 Rubens on board and a lot of people. I think it was about 332 for this voyage, at least to start with. And anyway, Pelsard's story of the shipwreck is a Mars Ret mood. Anyway, so evening of the 4th of June, 1629, he's in his bunk and they hit some rocks. And they hit with sufficient intensity that he gets thrown out of his bunk. Comes up on deck. Jacobs, the actual captain, and we'll come back to why this is important, he gets asked, where are we? Like, do you even know where we are? And Jakob says, no, I have no idea, because they'd hit these rocks. And Pelsard could see not too much surf around the boat, the actual ship, but he could see 100 or so feet out in every direction, the waves breaking. So they'd hit a substantial reef, effectively. Jacobs didn't know where they were, and Pelsard decided, even though it was a sort of substantial reef in front of him that he could see, he's like, okay, well, get in a boat, drop the anchor, we'll pull it back, but we'll drop the anchor behind the boat and we'll try and pull the ship off the rocks. But again, they didn't know where they were, so they didn't know how deep it was or how far back the rocks go. So he abandons the first idea. So there's your kind of plan 1 not going to work. From the aft castle, he could see that they were actually probably completely surrounded. And it was, if you look at where the wreck was subsequently found, it's one of those weird twists of fate that it actually got quite a way into the reef before it hit the rocks. So it didn't hit them on the outside. Anyway, as a result, he could see there was nowhere probably good to slide the boat back off that wouldn't cause more damage. And besides, they'd sort of missed the window because as the sun was rising, the tide was going out and he could start to see more and more rocks. So there was, the slide off the rocks option was off the table. And actually, if you've seen or experienced tides going out over reefs, obviously the water doesn't all drop at once. So you actually get a gradual diminishment, but the waves keep washing back as it slowly sort of sinks around it. And this was happening to the Batavia. And each time it would happen, it would lift this sort of 250-ton ship and crash it back down on the rocks with this sort of crack. And it would weaken the hull each time, and it started snapping the oak planks. And then, because of the oak planks snapping, the mast was like 55 meters. So if you're not used to thinking in meters, that's more than an Olympic pool. And because of it had sort of come loose as a result of this crashing back down on the rocks. And so each time it was lifted up, not only was the hull cracking down, but the actual main mast was pile driving into the boat. So Pelsard's like, right, we need to do something about the mast. We couldn't pull off the rocks. That's priority 1. Cut it down. And so they did. They sort of tried to cut it down at several different levels, and eventually they did cut it down. And not only did it get caught in the rigging and tear more as it fell, it came down across the hull and topside and couldn't be pulled or pushed off it. So he'd done more damage to the boat even as the water is going out and continually crashing the hull. So trying to save the ship, plan after plan. This is his experience, right? As the sun rose, and this is another nice twist of fate, I guess, they could see that there were a number of islands, probably only 1 or 2 nautical miles away. And Pelsard waited, because they were sort of stuck on the rocks. He waited for the tide to come back in to make sure that these islands weren't covered at the high tide. And they weren't. So once he saw that, he said, abandon ship. We're done here. Everyone make for the islands. They had a sort of longboat and a sloop that they could use to get there. But the way the Batavia had hit the rocks, they could actually only disembark quite slowly because there was only one place where you could get off the deck and onto these ships. And more than that, I mean, Pelsard's plan was to save souls first, as you're supposed to do as a captain, right? But because you had a kind of mixed company, it was very much every man for himself, and even more than that, people were going at the riches and the treasure to make sure that they could bring that with them. They were looking to start new lives or whatever. And so while they were trying to get at the water and food, the supplies that they could put on the boats to take to the islands so that they could live, he kind of had to abandon that because people were getting at the liquor and the silver and all this other stuff. What made all of this worse is the morale on the boat at the time. And this is where the story gets fucking a little bit rune super, a little bit cool, because essentially they had... Well, this guy, Hieronymus Cornelius, was a bankrupt pharmacist, but he was also the acolyte of a sort of satanic still life painter by the name of Terentius. He wasn't quite satanic, but he sort of was. He was a Christian heretic who believed that God mandated that humans experience, and obviously men, but humans experience the complete fulfillment of all pleasures. And he was actually abandoned. Well, he was kicked out of Holland or the Low Countries, but demonstrating, I suppose, that the English aristocracy hasn't changed all that much. The English welcomed him and he became a royal painter for James II, this sort of quasi-satanic Marquis de Sade, but kind of in a weird way more dull. Anyway, so Cornelius' plan was to somehow get control of the ship and start a utopian Terentian colony beyond Europe's reach. And he was kind of on his way to doing that. He'd already, Jacobs, the captain, he'd already convinced over to his side. And that's because Jacobs was a bit of a drunk, apparently, and Pelsad would publicly dress him down. And so once they were restocking in South Africa, that was when Cornelius saw his opportunity to kind of start poisoning the captain against the supercargo. And that kind of worked. So the crash wasn't expected to happen, but Jacobs was frankly not sailing the boat, the Batavia, towards Batavia at this point. It's one of the reasons why they hit the rocks. Now, the second thing that happened was on the voyage from South Africa, and before they had the crash, there was a gang sexual assault of one of the highborn women, which was arranged by Cornelius, and the thinking behind it was that Pelsad would come down so hard on these people who had perpetrated the sexual assault that would trigger the mutiny. Like he might throw them overboard. He might do something to the actual shipmen that would trigger that, and then it would be Jacobs and Cornelius on the boat, and they would either go pirating or sail it to some island in Polynesia and then, scuttle it and live quietly in some kind of confusing utopian paradise with the people on board. But because the perpetrators of the sexual assault were masked, and Pelsat was, although dour, kind of a stickler for the rules, as you can kind of tell he's doing his best already, he couldn't determine or prove, based on this poor girl's testimony, who had done what to her. So that bit had failed. Anyway, and that's the backstory, and it took a little over 24 hours to get everyone onto the nearby islands, and waves were crashing over the top, like the poop deck, by this point. So what you had was them split over two islands. There was about 40 on one island that was called, well, for obvious reasons, is now called Traitors Island, and about 180 on the other, which is called Beacon. Neither of them had any water, so that was the next thing that Pelsat had to work out how to do. It's like, well, they got food. They couldn't get as much water from the boat as they needed from the Batavia because everyone was going for the liquor and the silver. So he sent people out to search nearby islands unsuccessfly, couldn't find anything. So he made the decision. He took Jacobs and the sloop or whatever. It's about 30 foot long boat, and decided to head to mainland Australia because the crash, you can Google it, the Batavia was found in the 70s, which is how my grandfather started the story when I learnt it, right? So off he sails, leaving essentially, he's unaware of the traitors. He's unaware of Cornelius's sort of thinking and plans. But because he sailed off looking for water, this is where Cornelius saw the next opportunity. He managed to convince a lot of other people that, in fact, what Pelsart was doing was abandoning them and heading to Batavia, right? So he managed to trigger a mutiny right away. Pelsart, however, did look for water unsuccessfully for 8 days, and they'd run out more or less of water themselves. And so he had the option of going, well, I don't have water, neither do them. The closest European settlement is Batavia. So thirsty and ragged, he and the few people with him took 22 days to get the entire way to the Dutch East India Company port town of Batavia to try and, to raise the alarm and get help. They did find water halfway. It's a bit boring, but they did find water halfway in Java. But anyway, you see someone really still trying to achieve that original aim of getting these settlers or ship people to their destination. The Dutch East India Company promptly arrested Jacobs for negligence, but then did set about fixing up one of their sort of inter-islander boats to sail back under Pelsart's command to help the rescuers, right? The trip back, Mars Retrograde, was less speedy. The weather was against them the whole way. It took until, because remember they crashed June 4th, it took until September 13th to get back to Beacon Island, which is 3 months later, 3 months and a bit since the Batavia wrecked. And in the time he was gone, and pretty much as soon as Pelsart had left, Cornelius decided the first thing to do was to reduce pressure on their food supplies. This is the kind of weird, quasi-satanic cult thinking, right? He's clearly a full-blown psychopath. So his supporters attacked, raped, and murdered a few dozen of the other people who are unaware of the plan. And he and his closest supporters took some of the women as sex slaves at this point. Then, and this is like demonic genius stuff, right? Still too many mouths. So he sent 20 unarmed, I guess you would say guards, but people under his sway, to a nearby island to search for water. And this island's now called West Wallaby Island. And 20 days later, they looked, and 20 days later, they actually did find water and sent up the agreed smoke signal to say, hey, Cornelius, we found water. When Cornelius didn't come to get them, because they only had the one boat, he dropped them off, they worked out they had been scammed. But they had water and they had food because there was a bunch of sea lions around. So the other part of it, they're like, okay, well, we'll just stay here. We got the food, we got the water, whatever's going on, they'll come and get us. Now, over the course of the next month or so, a few escapees from Cornelius Island had built some rafts and sailed the sort of 1-ish nautical mile from their island to West Wallaby Island and told them, like, oh, look, and told the guys on West Wallaby Island, like, look, it's gone really bad. There's raping and there's murdering and it's crazy, and he's going to come and kill you because now he's worked out you've got water. He wants this island. So they built what is actually Australia's oldest European structure. They built a little fort on this island, which still stands. And I just like that kind of, I mean, going to school here and whatever, even in the 80s, you did get that very Anglo-supremacist view of European contact. But the reality is the first European structure built in Australia was a makeshift fort to protect from satanic cannibals. I don't know, beginners, you mean to continue or something. Cornelius' men did ultimately attack, several times, in fact, unsuccessfully. And he was captured and kept alive on the island with the fort. In the final attack, when they were coming to get him back and trying to take over the island once again, Pelsart's yacht, the one he'd borrowed from the Dutch East India Company, sailed into view. So they could see it sort of on the horizon or a bit closer than that. And in probably the good guys' first bit of luck, Pelsad sailed to West Wallaby Island first. Because if the risk was if they'd gone to Traders Island or Beacon Island, they would have got the Cornelis version of the story, right? Which would have meant that the guys on West Wallaby were the bad guys, please go and kill them, don't listen to anything they say, and so on. But they got to West Wallaby first, and the story of how Cornelis' men had been killing and eating and raping people, about 120 people in the end, of a total of 332. Some died during the shipwreck, but they'd killed 120 people in the 13 weeks that Cornelis was gone. So the next day, the inhabitants of West Wallaby Island and the Dutch East India Company yacht took back the other two islands because they had the boat and more guns and whatever at this point. And you just got to wonder, if you're Pelsad and you've been through the madness of trying to get these idiots off a boat, and then you've dropped them on an island, and right, I'm going to go get water, and then they start raping and eating each other, and you almost die twice trying to get there and back to save them, and you show up to this mess. He decided to court-martial Cornelis on the spot, presumably to get to the bottom of essentially how, everything had got so event horizon so quickly. Like, what the actual fuck are you up to? This is, even if you are a heretical Christian, like, in what way was this the correct plan? Anyway, he had both his hands cut off and hanged him on a nearby island. Before, coming back to the Mars Retrograde stuff, before heading back to Batavia, the town, Pelsad, because he's a company man, and he'd saved what was left of his charges from the satanic cannibals, more or less, and arrested the traders and so on. He's like, right, okay, we got a boat. Let's see what of the other stuff from the ship Batavia we can get, because there's a lot of things that belong to the company and company people. Might as well bring them back. So he sent one small boat to scout the surrounding islands to look for the sort of effectively considerable amount of treasure that they'd originally been carrying. And this small boat vanished. So there's about 4 people on that. Presumably it capsized and they all drowned, but you couldn't make this up. It's this sort of quiet little archipelago of islands, and he sends them on there's no cannibals or anything left, and they're gone. And that boat, obviously because it's little, it would have decayed by now. Never been found. No idea what happened to the people he sent to do a kind of diligent treasure hunt component. Nevertheless, because they also managed to pull some of the stuff from the wreck of the Batavia 13 weeks later. So we got some of the stuff and some of the survivors. And eventually, for the Batavia, they actually had to dive into the ruins to retrieve, into the hold, which was well and truly underwater, to retrieve what they could. And so then they set sail for Batavia, and they stopped once, and once only, to drop off the 2 youngest mutineers, because the decision had been made that they were potentially... They didn't know what they were doing. The rest of them were going to go and get put in prison. But they were given the option of you can come with and accept that fate, or you can be dropped off on what is essentially the coast of northwest Australia. And they were 18 and 24-year-old. And they were dropped off at the mouth of the Hutt River, which is kind of interesting because Matthew Flinders' accounts of the Indigenous Australians in the area about 150 years later, a bit more, said that they some of them were kind of lighter skinned than the others. So no one knows what happens to these Dutch boys, who, by the way, were technically Australia's first European settlers. Again, mutinous cannibals. No one knows what happened to them, but there is a sort of tantalizing possibility that they were absorbed into one of the local tribes and presumably married and had kids, and that's why some of them... It could have just been anything else. But nevertheless, so he drops these guys off, and then Pelsad finally sails in on a borrowed ship with some of the people and some of the cargo into Batavia, which is what he originally planned to do. And that was in October of 1629. And that, to me, is obviously an extreme example, but it is an example of what victory looks like during Mars Retrograde. Now, remember how I said this didn't happen during a Mars retrograde. It didn't. But funnily enough, the red planet did go retrograde the very next month, November 1629, which was when Pelsat was blamed for negligence in the wrecking of the ship and the saving of people, had his title stripped, had all his wealth taken off him by the company as recompense, and he died penniless and ashamed less than a year later. So Mars went backwards through his victories and his reputation and shredded the whole thing after all that. And that's your Mars retrograde ghost story. Until next time.